On November 30th, we already commented on the terrorist attack carried out by the Kiev regime against 2 tankers in the Black Sea, off the coast of Turkey and near the infrastructure facility of the International Caspian Pipeline Consortium in the waters of the port of Novorossiysk. Apparently, Kiev ignored the unequivocal reaction to this from Ankara and Astana by authorizing on December 1st a new attack using unmanned boats on a Russian commercial vessel, which was located 80 nautical miles from the Black Sea coast of Turkey. Fortunately, the crew and the vessel were not seriously harmed, but as we understand, all these terrorist acts pursue one goal. The goal is to disrupt the emerging peace process for resolving the conflict and to undermine navigational safety in the Black Sea region. The Kiev regime is a terrorist regime. No matter how much Western ideologists try to turn away from this truth themselves, no matter how much they try to blind their own people to it, there is an ever-increasing number of literally daily facts in our modern world confirming this blatant reality. That is truly undeniable, but it is not of natural origin. Rather, it is something artificially and intentionally created. Despite the guarantees for the protection of the Russian language in the constitution, the decision of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine was clearly a continuation of this very destructive course. It demonstrates that an absolutely anti-people regime is in power in Kyiv. How can something like this even be possible? People speak Russian, more so in Ukraine, and yet the regime is destroying the Russian language itself, as if it doesn't understand that this is the language people speak and think in. The people of Ukraine. What is happening with the language in Ukraine is utter madness. And of course, such steps indicate that there is no intention in Kyiv for a peaceful resolution. After all, one of its conditions should be the abolition of discrimination against the Russian language and Russian-speaking citizens, as well as respect for the rights of all nationalities living in Ukraine. I call on international organizations to give an objective assessment of this decision by the Kyiv regime and to take measures to urge it to fulfill its obligations in the field of human rights. The current European elites, who have led the work of the OSCE into a complete dead end, must realize their full responsibility for the destruction of the Helsinki principles. But for that, they first need to acknowledge all of this, you see, before they can realize their responsibility. But they don't even want to acknowledge or see it. Yes, probably, there are still some chances left to save these very principles, but this very Western minority is destroying them. Accordingly, the chances are getting smaller with each passing day. That's why the question needs to be raised. Are the Westerners ready to move away from confrontational aggressive approaches? And if that doesn't happen, then the OSCE's disappearance into oblivion is simply inevitable. When it's convenient, Brussels uses human rights to put pressure on third countries. But when it's not convenient, and when human rights are actually being violated and there is something to discuss, they easily turn a blind eye to any human rights violations, both in European Union member states and in certain EU candidate countries, for example, in Ukraine. There's no telling what hasn't happened to human rights in Ukraine. Essentially, those rights simply don't exist there. Has the European Union said anything? Anything at all? And it's not even a question of Ukraine not being an EU member. They constantly comment on countries that aren't part of their community. Moldova doesn't raise any concerns for them under the Sandu regime, but before or without Sandu, it did. That's just how it always is. I just want to emphasize that the European Union has no moral right whatsoever to lecture others, especially in its current state, nor can it ever have one. We see how the European Union continues its agonizing, almost hysterical search for ways to actually confiscate, that is, steal, frozen Russian sovereign assets in order to keep their adventure in the form of the corrupt Kyiv regime afloat for a little while longer. Additionally, to invest further in the military-industrial complex in the futile hope that it will somehow act as a locomotive to pull the EU economy out of the deepening crisis. There is also a separate statement at the highest political level that since Moscow's money is in the hands of the European Union, it is the EU that has the right to decide what to do with it. They speak for themselves. In other words, this is simply, of course, an unbelievable story. This is outright criminal. And at the same time, within the European Union, there is an underlying understanding that theft, especially on such a large scale, will not go unnoticed for the participants in this criminal scheme, and that they will have to answer for it one way or another. As a result, there is an active process of shifting responsibility onto one another. In the not-so-noble EU family, considering what they've done, practically every means has already been employed, up to and including open threats, blackmail, and fake news. Nothing has been created or invented that could legitimize this theft, which cannot be qualified as anything else. Therefore, preparations for a package of retaliatory measures in the event of actual theft or seizure of assets belonging to the Russian Federation are already underway. I can say that. Yesterday, such a law was published and it came into force on the very same day. The Russian embassy in Chisinau, perhaps you know, but if not, I'll tell you, received a note from the Moldovan Ministry of Foreign Affairs notifying them of the intention to terminate the aforementioned intergovernmental agreement. It is precisely on the basis of this agreement that the Russian House, the Russian Center for Science and Culture, operates in Chisinau. We regard this decision, as we have said in advance, as yet another step aimed at destroying the centuries-old Russian-Moldovan ties. The claim that this center is, as stated by the authorities, an instrument of hybrid warfare against the Republic of Moldova is perceived by Moldovans simply as a mockery of the people. There is an active collection of signatures for petitions to overturn the decision to close the Russian House. At present, more than 5,000 people, by the way, have spoken out in favor of this. I want to repeat once again, we have already talked about this, but I want to emphasize it. Russia strictly adheres to the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Accusations of encroaching on Moldova's sovereignty are empty propaganda slogans, unsupported by evidence, especially since such evidence simply does not exist.
The recent meeting between the President of Russia and the special envoys of the US President took place just the other day, and in this regard, I have a question. Did the Russian Foreign Ministry receive any instructions from the President as a result of this meeting? And if so, what were they?
This question was answered by Yuri Ushakov, who said that the details of these meetings would not be made public because, as you correctly noted, these meetings are working meetings. If I recall, you mentioned this in your question, focused on achieving results, not on outward appearances, although that is certainly important as well, considering that the international community is already tired of aggressive, destructive statements and these waves of destructive information that are, so to speak, becoming more prevalent, now coming from Brussels and Western Europe. But first and foremost, this meeting was focused on achieving concrete results.